Okay, today I'm going to do an introductory video on loops in JavaScript. And I went ahead and kind of brought in a Bootstrap starter template to kind of start from. And I have a JavaScript file called loops.js. So we'll just start by linking to that. And the defer attribute, and talk about why loops are important. And just like the conditionals that you find in just about any language, loops are the same way. And if conditionals, I said conditionals make our programs smart, loops make our programs powerful. And what I mean by that is you can write a little bit of code that loops and executes multiple times, as many times as you need. So by writing a little bit of code, it appears to the end user to do a lot of work, when in reality, it's the same logic, just executed many times. And so conditionals make our programs smart, loops make them powerful. They are so powerful in programming that they're in just about every language. So these are super fundamental basics of learning to program, is to learning to program with loops. And so let's just get a little console log going here to make sure that the code that we write is linked up and running. There's my hello world, so that's good. And let's talk about loops. Now I'll just go ahead and in my HTML do a paragraph with an ID of output, and we'll talk about loops a little bit. Now there are several kinds of loops. Some of the kinds are more popular than other. We'll kind of start with the lesser popular and move into the more popular. So we've got a while loop, a little bit, not to say that people don't use them, but they're not as popular as, for example, a for loop. And then there's also, and there are others, there's a for of loop that we'll talk about in here, and a for in loop. And so these are some of the loops built into JavaScript that we will go ahead and cover. Now, I find it beneficial, as a teacher who's been teaching loops to beginning students for a long time, to break down the parts of a loop and show basically how those parts, the pieces of a loop, are in all these loops. And the pieces, regardless of the keyword and the type of loop that you're using, these pieces exist across all these loops types. So what are the pieces? So the first piece is a variable to control the number of iterations. And so, you call this a control variable. And so in here, I'll say let. A lot of times the convention is your control variable is given the identifier of I. And so I is just going to be a variable that we're going to use in our loop to control the number of iterations. And I think if I kind of bring in this while loop, we could say while I is less than 10. Well, pretty quickly, you see that I is a variable that controls the number of iterations. Well, as long as this is true, so what goes in the parentheses, just like on an if statement, what goes in the parentheses is a Boolean expression. This Boolean expression has to evaluate to true or false. Therefore, the value of I, as long as this loop is true, this loop will continue to run. And so I controls, basically as soon as I is not less than 10, this loop will no longer run. So I is your control variable. The second part that we have right here is a test of the control variable. So part one is declaring a control variable. Part two is testing the control variable. So what is this going to do? This is going to loop from 0, and let's just say, is 0 less than 10? Well, that's true, so we enter the body of the loop. And then what are we going to do? Well, let's go ahead and put the output equal to I. And then the third part of this loop that has to happen is modify the control variable. And so we need to do something like I++ that is going to, this wants me to be, let's see, I'm not going to worry about these little yellow squigglies right now. I++ modifies our control variable. Otherwise, I is always 0. 0 is always less than 10. So that puts us, if you don't change I to something else, that gives us what's called an infinite loop. It's just going to loop infinitely. And that ultimately would cause your web browser to crash or stop responding a lot of times. You'll see web browser not responding. And you'll need to, close it in the task manager in Windows. So, inside of the loop, you do something in the loop. In this case, we just output it to here. Now, keep in mind, every time through the loop, we're just changing the inner text equal to the latest number. So this is going to loop 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. I will then go to 10. 10 is not less than 10. So the output here will be 9. Like that'll be the last number that you see. That will be the only number you see because we change the inner text to I every time. In other words, we overwrite the inner text every time through the loop. And so it's kind of difficult to see that this loop is in fact looping because all you really get is the output here, which is 9, right? If you want a better demonstration of this loop working, maybe instead of equals, we'll do we'll concatenate our inner text and add the strings together, or the numbers, and then we kind of get this little output where you see that it goes through a loop. Every time through the loop it prints out the number and appends it. Now, if you want to get spaces in there or commas, you could do all sorts of things, we could do equals I, and we learned this syntax here where you do I and a space. Right, and so this is a template string syntax where we print the value of I and a space on the inner text, and that way we're appending an I and a space. Now, of course, that didn't work. I've done it other ways. I was just trying this, and it didn't work. Let's just try I plus a tab. It didn't like the white space. No, it didn't like the tab either. Let's try, I'm going to try something I've done in the past, which pause. So, I had done this in the past so many times and got it to work, and then all of a sudden in my demo it wasn't working. And always in the past I would use inner HTML instead of inner text. And it turns out inner HTML is a little bit more responsive to this space and allowed the space versus inner text didn't. And so so with HTML, it does allow for single space. Now, if you hit this, you know, if I think of HTML and I kind of go into here and I put a paragraph and I put like 10 spaces, it's not, you know, and then some letters, these 10 spaces typically aren't recognized, but it will recognize a space or two inside of an element. And so, like if I were to have like one space, it's receptive to that. So the difference between inner text and inner HTML is inner HTML, you know, you can put tags and that kind of stuff in there. So like I want NBSP semicolon, right? So this is an HTML non-breaking space. And it would kind of work the same way. Either way, it would work with a space here or a non-breaking space special character. And again, not that that's the important part of this lecture, but inner HTML was more responsive to that. Okay, moving on. So this is a while loop, and again, the three parts of this loop are a control variable, testing the control variable, and modifying the control variable. And you know, you can modify it by 1, as I did here. I just increased I by 1. If I want to change I by something else, like I'll do I plus equals 2. And as I refresh, I get 0, 2, 4, 6, 8. Of course, as soon as I becomes 10, 10 is not less than 10. So you break out of the loop. So, you know, what if I, you know, keep on going, less than 100? And you could see how it, you know, it's pretty easy to rerun this code. You know, we just change it from less than 10 to less than 100, and boom, you got the output. You know, if you're just kind of curious, where does it stop? The answer is somewhere. Now my loop's taking a good while to iterate. What's the number here? 100,000? Clearly no user would want this. More than likely, if your script takes up too much of your computer's resources, it won't ultimately work. Again, not the important part of the demonstration, but clearly there's a limit. There it goes. It just takes a lot of work. Now, I'm not going to continue to expand on that, but you can see it does take longer, and I've got a pretty doggone fast computer. So that's a while loop. You'll see that out in the wild. I guess the other thing to know about a while loop, is known as a pre-test loop, meaning it will test the condition before the body of the loop runs. So where's the body of the loop? In between, well, these curly braces is the body. So if this while loop is, if this condition is false, it means that the body will never run. So let me demonstrate that. You know, if I is less than 100,000, well, I is not less than 100,000. I is bigger. So this body will never run. And so you can see we're not spinning up here. The loop is not spinning. It just tested the condition. The condition was false. So the body of the loop never ran, and it never output any information. So it is a pre-test loop, meaning it will test the condition before the body runs. So now moving on to a do while. A do while is structured like so. So let's set our I back to 0. We're going to use the same control variable. We're going to use I. Actually, no, because this loop would change I. So let's just comment out this loop. So we're not caring about a while loop anymore, but we'll use the same control variable. So that's part 1, define our control variable. Let's print out I to the screen, enter HTML, while I is less than 10. So, I mean, it's pretty much going to do the same thing. There's one subtle difference. So the 3 parts, here's testing the condition. And I++ is going to increment I. Increment the control variable. So part 1, declare a control variable. Part 2, test the condition. Part 3, increment the control variable. So 3 different parts. Of course, your body of the loop should do something. And to demonstrate this as a do-while loop, it does the same thing. Like, it loops. It's just another control structure of doing the same thing. There's one key difference in a do-while. You'll notice that the condition comes after the body, right? So a do-while, notice all my keywords are lowercase. Do-while is a post-test loop, meaning it tests the condition after the body executes once. So if I set I to 11, notice it's going to print out 11. It'll change it to 12, and it'll say while 12 is less than 10. Well, 12 is not less than 10, so that's it. The loop is over. The body runs one time because it is a post-test loop. The body will run once, and if I is never true, it will never run a second time. Right. It's worth mentioning that after the loop, then the code just continues running down from top to bottom. Right, so kind of looking at the output here, even though the condition is never true, the body of the loop runs once because it's a do-while, which is a post-test loop. So if you know that you've got some logic that you want to execute once, and maybe you want to execute it a bunch of times, a do-while is a great loop for that. So that's the second kind of loop, right? Let's go ahead and comment that one out. I'm going to comment out my control variable here. Let's talk about a for loop. Notice when I type in for, I've got a standard. Let's type in for tab, that didn't work. For, there it goes. So if I type in for, this for loop actually gives me an emit keystroke, and it fills this in for me. So let's break this down. Notice it's wanting to work with an array. It is very common for loops to work with arrays, so I'll do that a little bit here in a little bit, but let's look at a for loop. And notice they call their control variable index instead of I. Okay, so I called it I, they call it index, I representing index. While index is less than the length of an array, meaning the number of elements in an array. Now we don't have an array, so I'll just keep my example of index less than 10, index plus plus. So notice all 3 parts are right here in a for loop. So a for loop is great because all 3 parts of the loop are in one place. For loops are often called count control loops because on one line you can count how many iterations of that loop there will be. Like I can see this starts at 0, it goes up by 1, and while it's less than 10, I know there's 10 iterations, 0 through 9. Right, so if I kind of condense this all into one place. You know, the problem with, like for example, a while loop, in my quick example, all the 3 parts are more or less right in one place. But in the real world, your application could be thousands of lines of code. Your control variable could be on line 100. Your while loop could be on line 1000. And your modification of the control could be on line 2000. Like, you'd have to scroll all through this source code and try and hunt down how this loop is iterating, like how it's being controlled and modified. That's what makes a for loop so beautiful, is that it's all in one place. And so for loops are great, most commonly used kind of loop because of that benefit. Again, not to say that while loops don't exist, because they do. Programmers use them or do whiles, but for loops are definitely great, right? So just like I'll do before, I'll just print out index as my output. And there's index with my space and my template string in our HTML. Okay, so let's just print out the numbers. So it's important to learn like how to control these, right? So if I want this loop to print out, I want it to iterate for all the even numbers, right? I'll start off at 0, or I'll start off at 2. Like zeros. I think 0 is not even, not odd. So right, pretty sure about that. So we'll start off at 2, and we'll say while 2 is less than or equal to 100, we'll increment it by 2, plus equals 2. So we're starting at 2, we're incrementing by 2, up until the point it becomes 100, and including 100, because of the equals, we're going to print out index. That's a prior example. And then there's my example of 2 through 100, even numbers, 2 through 100. Right, so just changing the different pieces, the control variable. Now we're starting at 1, while it's less than 100, we're incrementing by 2, so that's printing out the odd numbers. We could change it, let's print out 10, 20, 30, 40, right? So we're gonna start it at 10, increase it by 10, so by changing these different pieces, of a for loop, we're changing the number of iterations of the loop, or changing, basically how it functions, how it works, how many times it runs. Now, it was interesting that, it talked about arrays. Remember we did an array earlier in a prior video, and we just had I think here's what we did. We had something like this. And when I went to print out the array, I just printed out I did something like this. Right, so I just put the data into the inner HTML of a paragraph, and you got this output. And that's great, but what if you don't want exactly that output? We could do something a little bit different. Like, here's an unordered list. Give it an idea of data. And let's use a for loop. For. Now our data has our array. So what you wind up using is a for loop to iterate over each individual piece of data. And so you start the index at 0. Well, because data, the first element, is at sub 0. Right? You loop through the array.length. Well, what do you think the length is of this array? Well, the length of this array is 4. It's not array.length, it's data.length and data subindex. So this is a loop that's going to loop over every element. It's going to loop 0, 1, 2, and 3. While 3 is less than 4, that is true. As soon as index goes to 4, 4 is not less than 4, so you break out of the loop. So for loops are great for doing just that exact thing, of iterating over an array. And you'll notice here this element reads data subindex. What we could do, instead of reading that into an array, we could just do our output here. Document.get element by ID. What do we call our list? We called it data. That might be confusing. Let's just call it data lists. I don't know. So we'll just sign my different name. Data list dot inner HTML equals, and let's do a template string. But we're going to put this inside of an LI. So each one of these is a list item. So what's data subindex? Well, index is 0. Well, what's data sub 0? Well, that's my name. And then and then index goes to 1. And then it prints out data sub 1. Well, what's sub 1? That's Ellie's name. And then it prints, and then index goes to 2. And what's at 2? Well, that's the value true, right? And so each one of those should go inside of a. Now, why is it doing this? Remember, because we didn't append, we just overwrote. So now if we append, now we can get our data out of the array and into some sort of unordered list in our HTML. And so that's why you typically loop over your data using a for loop. And in fact, one more thing I want to talk about before I move on, because I'm actually winding down. Yeah, I want to make it 45 minutes or less. I'm doing plenty fine. We're at 27 minutes. One thing when I was a new programmer, and I think it's important to understand, is the order of operations on a for loop. And when I was a beginning programmer, I didn't understand how this works. What happens is that your control variable is initialized first, and then the test occurs. And if the test is true, you run the body. And then after you run the body, you modify the control variable. And then you run the test again. And if the test is again true, then you run the body and you modify the control variable. And then you run the test. And if the test is true, you run the body, increment, or modify, and test. So you might think, as I did when I was a beginner, that's not what happens. You might think it goes declare and initialize a control variable, test that control variable, and then modify the control variable, and then run the body. That's not right. That was my mistake when I was a beginner. So I just wanted to share that because that's something I remember not working how I thought it would work. Okay. A for loop is also a pre-test loop, just like the while loop. Right? If you want a post-test loop, the only one that we've learned, the only one that I know of that is a do while. It's also called a count controlled loop, because oftentimes you can just like look here and count. Well, what's the length of our array? Well, the length is 4, The index is 0. We're incrementing by 1. So this is going to loop 0 through 3. 0, 1, 2, 3. So it's going to loop 4 times. So the count controlled means you can count how many iterations there will be, just like I just did. Turns out that the for loop, I almost forgot, forEach. So here's a forEach loop, and this is built into our array. So if I do data dot forEach element, and then I'll just do document dot get element by ID data list dot enter HTML plus equals, and I'll write my little template string. And now I just use the word element. So in this for loop, over here I had to use the index of each element in the array. And here they just make it accessible, one element at a time. We're going to loop through the array dot forEach. Let's get an element, one element at a time, and print that element in an li. And so this is kind of a shorthand. This forEach is a condensed for loop. You don't have to write out the index and looping through the array and incrementing by 1, because this is done so often, they make the shorthand forEach. Right? And the first time through the loop, element holds the value Evan. The second time through the loop, element holds Ellie. The third time through the loop, element holds true. The fourth time through the loop, it holds the value of 2. You can also put a JavaScript object, and we'll get into these things. Unnecessarily quoted. There we go. Missing a space. Just in like space. Space. Just to, yeah, and this isn't going to work exactly the same way. We'll get into JavaScript objects, but arrays can hold objects as well. I didn't need to go down that path. So one shorthand is the forEach. Another kind of newer shorthand and a newer, keep in mind, JavaScript version. When I say JavaScript version, technically they're called ECMAScripts, ECMA scripts, and they're like synonyms, JavaScript versions and ECMAScript versions. So in a newer ECMAScript version or newer JavaScript version, they have for of. And so you could say const element of data this is a for of loop, and for ofs are typically used to loop through arrays, as we're doing here. I'm just looking at the MDN document on for of. So to iterate over objects, Arrays. So here's an array. Here's a for of looping over the array, and you'll see here's mine doing the same thing. Giving you the same output. We'll cover forIn in a later video because those are for your actual objects like I was doing a little bit earlier to loop over objects. See, here's, I said later, but here it is. So here's an object that has key and values, and this allows us to get the property. So this will print out 1, 2, and 3. So that's forIn versus forOf, but we got to talk about objects before we really get into the forIn. Since we've talked about arrays, we could do forOfs and use them with our arrays. Any questions out there? We just covered a lot of information.
I'm good so far.
Yeah, me too. It was a good review for groups last semester, so that was nice.
Yeah, forEach compared to C# is going to be a little bit different. As far as you do the array name for each, and this forOf, we didn't have that in C#. So there's some newer things here as well. All right, good place to stop the recording.